The courtroom was unusually quiet, save for the soft rustle of papers and the shuffling of feet. The air felt heavy, thick with anticipation, as everyone waited for the trial to begin. A large clock ticked steadily on the wall, its rhythmic sound echoing in the silence. The bright overhead lights cast sharp shadows across the wooden benches, creating an atmosphere of cold formality. People in the audience sat with stern faces, their eyes fixed on the young girl standing alone at the center of the courtroom. She looked out of place there, almost as if the room was too big for her, too daunting. A little girl, barely 10, standing in front of a judge, accused of something serious. Her name was Olivia Brooks. Her skin was a deep shade of brown, her hair pulled back into a messy ponytail, strands falling loose around her face. She clutched the sleeve of her oversized hoodie tightly in her small hands, looking at the floor more than she looked up. Judge William Carter, a man in his 50s, dressed in a dark robe, leaned back in his chair. He had seen many cases, many faces, many stories. But there was something different about Olivia, something that pulled at him in a way he couldn't quite explain. The way she stood, her shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world was pressing down on her. It was as if she wasn't just standing before him. She was standing alone, abandoned by the very system that was meant to protect her. "Olivia Brooks," Judge Carter called, his voice gentle but firm. "Do you understand why you are here?" Olivia hesitated. The room seemed to get smaller around her, and the judge's voice felt like it was coming from far away. She could feel the eyes of everyone on her, and it made her stomach twist in knots. The girl slowly nodded, though she didn't look up. Her eyes remained fixed on the floor. There was something in her gaze, something deep and unsettling. She wasn't just nervous, she was scared. And it wasn't the kind of fear that came from a child who had been caught doing something wrong. It was the kind of fear that came from years of living with nothing but empty days and cold nights. Judge Carter adjusted his glasses and waited for her to speak. She had a right to say something, to tell her side of the story. But she remained quiet, as if she had said everything she could, and nothing more mattered. "Olivia," the judge said again, this time with a softening tone. "Do you understand what you're being accused of?" This time, Olivia lifted her head slightly, but her eyes still stayed low. She spoke in a soft, almost inaudible voice. I was hungry." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Valerie Cooper, froze. Her pen, poised above the paperwork, hovered in the air. A few gasps came from the audience, but the judge remained silent, his eyes fixed on the small girl. He had expected many things, many excuses, maybe even some defiance. But this was different. The silence stretched on, and for a long moment, no one spoke. The judge's eyes softened. "What do you mean, Olivia?" "Hungry." Olivia's shoulders trembled slightly, but she still wouldn't look up. She took a deep breath before speaking again, her voice breaking, just a little. "I stole food from the grocery store. I was hungry." The courtroom gasped in unison. Whispers swirled around the room like a gust of wind. "What did she say?" One person muttered, "She stole food, but she's just a child." Another whispered, but Olivia heard none of it. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks, the tears starting to sting at the corners of her eyes. She didn't want to cry. She didn't want to show weakness, but there was nothing she could do to stop it. Judge Carter felt a knot tighten in his chest. He hadn't expected this. He had expected a simple case, maybe a warning. But hunger. How could anyone stand here, in this room, in front of strangers, and admit they stole because they were hungry? He set the gavel down gently and leaned forward, his gaze softening. "Olivia," he said, his voice quieter now, "do you know that stealing is wrong?" She nodded quickly, the words rushing out in a shaky whisper. "Yes, sir. I know it's wrong." Judge Carter took a deep breath. This wasn't just a case of petty theft. There was something deeper, something more troubling. He had seen many kids in his courtroom over the years, but none had affected him like this girl. There was something about her, something that made him want to help her. "Do you have parents, Olivia?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. She shook her head almost immediately, and the motion seemed almost automatic, as if she had answered this question 1,000 times before. "No," she said quietly. "My mom left a long time ago. She said she'd come back, but she didn't. And my dad, he was never around." The words hung in the air, and for the first time in his career, Judge Carter felt his heart ache for someone in his courtroom. He had dealt with criminals, with hardened adults, with cases that made him lose sleep. But this was different. "And where do you live, Olivia?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly as he leaned forward. His mind raced. How could a child be here, alone, without anyone to care for her? "I live in an old house," Olivia replied, her voice barely audible. "It's falling apart. There's no one there but me. Sometimes I don't even have food." Her words trailed off, and her face tightened as if she had said too much. She turned away, pressing her sleeve against her eyes to wipe away the tears that had begun to fall. She didn't want to cry. She didn't want to seem weak. But it was hard not to. Judge Carter's throat tightened. He glanced around the courtroom, noticing the murmurs of the audience, the pity in their eyes. But none of that mattered right now. Olivia was standing in front of him, a child, alone and hungry. How could he possibly follow the law when everything in his heart told him to do something else? For a moment, the courtroom seemed to fade away. There was no prosecutor, no defense attorney, no jury, just him and Olivia, standing in a room filled with judgment and questions. "What did you steal, Olivia?" the judge asked, his voice quiet now, as if he was speaking to a friend. Olivia bit her lip before answering. "Bread, fruit, things like that." His eyes softened. She hadn't stolen money. She hadn't stolen something for herself, for pleasure. She had taken food. Basic, necessary food. "Olivia," the judge said, his voice almost a whisper, "do you understand that you broke the law?" She nodded. "Yes, sir." He exhaled slowly. There was a long silence before he spoke again. "You are guilty of stealing, Olivia." But he paused, glancing at the prosecutor, then the audience. "I believe that there are other things at play here, things that need to be addressed." The courtroom was silent as the judge's words sank in. No one knew what he meant. Olivia didn't either, but she looked up at him, hope sparking in her eyes for the first time that day. And in that moment, Judge Carter knew that this case wasn't going to be like any other he had ever faced. It was about more than just the law. It was about doing what was right. And what was right, at that very moment, was to help Olivia Brooks. The audience waited in anticipation, their eyes locked on the judge. What would he do next? The judge sat back in his chair, his fingers resting on the edge of the desk. His mind kept racing, trying to process what had just happened. Olivia's words echoed in his head. "I was hungry." He had expected many things in his courtroom, but never this. Never a young girl, standing alone, confessing that she had stolen just to survive. He glanced at her again. Olivia's head was still down, her eyes never meeting his. Her shoulders were slumped, as if the weight of the world was pushing her down. The courtroom around them seemed to blur. The murmurs of the audience, the rustle of papers, none of it mattered. All he could think about was Olivia. This wasn't a case about petty theft. This was about a child in desperate need. For a moment, Judge Carter felt completely out of his depth. He had seen countless cases in his years on the bench. Some involved hardened criminals, some involved teenagers making mistakes. But Olivia was different. She wasn't a criminal. She was a child, lost and alone in a world that had failed her. How could he decide what was just when the circumstances were so wrong? He cleared his throat and leaned forward. "Olivia, I have to ask, do you live with anyone?" Olivia's eyes flickered toward him for a brief second before she quickly lowered her gaze again. Her voice trembled as she answered, barely above a whisper. No, sir. I live by myself. A chill ran down Judge Carter's spine. A child, alone. How could that be possible? His mind spun with questions. How had she ended up in this situation? Who had left her to fend for herself? The prosecutor, Valerie Cooper, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Judge Carter, I think we need to address this. Clearly, this is not a normal case. We can't just ignore the law. Judge Carter nodded slowly. I'm not ignoring the law, Miss Cooper. But I think we need to understand why this happened first. Olivia, can you tell me where you've been living? Olivia swallowed, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her hoodie. She looked down at the floor, avoiding his gaze once again. I have a house. It's old. It's falling apart. There's no one there but me. The words struck Judge Carter like a punch in the stomach. A house, but no parents, no family. The thought was unimaginable. A child, living alone in a house that wasn't even safe, with no one to care for her. How had this happened? And why hadn't anyone noticed? The prosecutor raised an eyebrow, her tone sharp. Your Honor, we need to take a closer look at her circumstances. She's a young girl, but her actions still matter. She still broke the law. I understand, Miss Cooper, Judge Carter said, his voice calm but firm. But right now, we need to understand how a 10-year-old ends up stealing food to survive. I'm not making any decisions until I have more information. The courtroom fell silent again. All eyes were on Olivia. She had spoken about living alone, but there was so much more to her story. What had led to this moment? What was she hiding? Finally, Olivia spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. My mom, she left me a long time ago. She said she was going to the store, but she didn't come back. She was gone. Her voice cracked as she continued. I waited for her to come back. But she didn't. And my dad, he was never there. Judge Carter felt a tightness in his chest. He had heard stories before. Stories of children abandoned by their parents, of lives ruined by neglect. But hearing it from Olivia, from a child who was standing right in front of him, made it all so real, so much more painful. How could a mother leave her child like this? How could a father not care? Olivia, where do you get your food? The judge asked, trying to steer the conversation to something more practical, something that might offer a clue to how she was surviving. She looked up briefly, her eyes filled with uncertainty, as if she wasn't sure whether to trust him. I get food from the store. Sometimes people give me leftovers. She paused for a moment before continuing. Sometimes I don't eat at all. The courtroom grew still. Judge Carter had no words to say. He couldn't imagine a child going days without food, without care. His mind raced with thoughts of what could be done to help her. But the legal system, the rules he had always followed, seemed so distant now. It wasn't just about the law. It was about what was right. Olivia, how long have you been living like this? He asked, his voice gentle. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand, trying to keep the tears in check. A long time, she answered. I don't remember exactly when, but it's been forever. The weight of her words hung in the air. Forever. For a 10-year-old, forever was a lifetime. How long had she been living in a place that wasn't a home? How long had she been trying to survive, all on her own? Judge Carter glanced at the prosecutor, who was looking at him with growing concern. We need to take action, Your Honor, she said, her voice sharp. This child is clearly in danger. She needs to be placed in a safe home, away from this situation. He didn't disagree with her, but something in his gut told him that there was more to this story than anyone in the courtroom understood. He couldn't make a decision in haste. Not yet. Turning back to Olivia, he asked one final question. Olivia, do you want to live with someone? Do you want a family? The question seemed to catch her off guard. She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Her eyes flickered with something. Hope, fear, longing. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Finally, she whispered, I don't know. I don't know if anyone wants me." The judge's heart ached. Olivia wasn't just a child who had been left behind by her parents. She was a child who had been told, in the deepest part of her heart, that she wasn't wanted, that she didn't deserve to be cared for. "Olivia," Judge Carter said gently, "I want you to know that you are wanted. You deserve to be cared for. You deserve a home." Her eyes met his, and for the first time, she didn't look away. "Do you really mean that?" she asked, her voice small, trembling with a mix of disbelief and hope. "I do," he said softly. "I do." For a moment, Olivia just stood there, as if trying to process his words. She didn't smile, but something in her eyes changed. Maybe it was the slightest flicker of hope. Maybe it was the realization that someone, just one person, cared. But before Judge Carter could say anything else, the prosecutor spoke again. "Your Honor, this child needs help. She can't stay here." Judge Carter nodded slowly. "I understand, Miss Cooper. I'm going to make sure she gets the help she needs. But I need time. I need to understand her situation fully before making any decisions." Olivia's eyes widened. She had never had anyone take this much time for her. She had never had anyone care this much. For the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, things could change. The courtroom was thick with anticipation. Olivia stood there, her small figure almost swallowed by the vast space around her. She was silent now, her gaze fixed firmly on the floor beneath her. She had told the truth, but now, as the moments ticked by, she couldn't shake the feeling that the world was about to come crashing down on her. She was scared. Not of the judge, not of the people around her, but of what would happen next. Judge Carter sat at the bench, his fingers tapping gently on the wooden surface in front of him. His mind was racing, but his face remained calm, collected. The law was clear. Olivia had stolen. It didn't matter why she did it. She had still broken the rules. But there was something in him, something deep inside, that refused to see her just as a criminal. She wasn't like the others who came through his courtroom. She wasn't just another case. He glanced at the prosecutor, Valerie Cooper, who was still standing beside her table, her arms crossed over her chest. She had made it clear that she wanted a punishment. After all, rules were rules. It was the only way to maintain order. But what kind of punishment could fit a crime like this? A child, starving and alone, who had taken food simply to survive. How could the law be so black and white in a world that was filled with so many shades of gray? Judge Carter adjusted his glasses and looked back at Olivia. She was so small, so fragile, standing there in front of him, her hoodie too large for her tiny frame. He could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the quiet desperation that seemed to radiate from her. He could feel her waiting, hoping, yet bracing for whatever was about to happen. The air in the courtroom seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. Every single person in the room was waiting for him to speak. The murmur of the audience had died down completely, and the only sound that remained was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Judge Carter cleared his throat, his voice breaking the stillness. "Olivia Brooks," he said, his tone soft but firm, "I have heard everything you have said today. And I must say, I find your situation troubling. No child should have to steal to survive. No child should have to live in fear, in hunger, alone." There was a long pause, as if his words were sinking in, not just to Olivia, but to everyone in the room. Valerie Cooper, the prosecutor, shifted uncomfortably. She knew the judge was a man of compassion, but she didn't think that would matter here. This was the law, and the law had to be followed. "Olivia," Judge Carter continued, "you did something wrong. You broke the law by stealing. But the reason you stole, your hunger, your desperation, that is not something that can be ignored." The courtroom was completely still, and Olivia's heart beat louder in her chest. She couldn't bear to look up at the judge, but she couldn't look away either. His voice, though kind, was full of authority. He had a decision to make, and whatever it was, she would have to accept it. Judge Carter took a deep breath, his gaze shifting from Olivia to the prosecutor. This is not a case where punishment should be the only solution. This is a case where we need to ask ourselves, why did this happen? He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was quiet now, the tension almost unbearable. No one expected what came next. "I am going to make a decision that might surprise you," Judge Carter said, his voice steady but resolute. "Olivia Brooks, you are guilty of stealing, but I am not going to punish you the way the law would normally dictate." The prosecutor's eyebrows shot up. "Your Honor, we can't just overlook the crime. Stealing is stealing." "I understand, Ms. Cooper," Judge Carter replied. "But I believe there are circumstances that cannot be ignored. This is not just about what you did, Olivia. It's about why you did it. A child cannot be punished for doing what she had to do to survive." The courtroom was silent. Olivia's heart raced, her mind spinning. She had no idea what was happening. Was the judge going to send her away? Was she in trouble? She didn't know if she should feel relieved or even more afraid. "I have spoken to the Social Services Department," Judge Carter continued, "and I have learned that Olivia has no family. She has no home. She has been living alone, surviving however she can, with no one to care for her, and no one to guide her. This child is not a criminal. She is a victim of neglect." Olivia's breath caught in her throat. Was he talking about her? Did he mean that she wasn't in trouble? Her hands clenched the fabric of her hoodie, and her eyes stayed on the floor, but she could feel a flicker of hope deep inside her chest. Could it be true? Could someone actually care? The prosecutor's voice broke the silence. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I understand that this is an unfortunate situation. But the law is clear. This child stole. She needs to be held accountable for her actions." Judge Carter met her gaze, his expression calm but unyielding. "I am aware of the law, Ms. Cooper, but the law must also serve justice, not just punishment. And what Olivia needs right now is not to be punished. What she needs is a chance. A chance to have a home. A chance to be a child, not a survivor." The words hung in the air like a weight, and for a moment, no one moved. Olivia dared to look up. Her eyes were wide, filled with uncertainty and a glimmer of something else. Hope. The kind of hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. "Olivia Brooks," Judge Carter said, his voice softening, "I am sentencing you to community service. You will help in local food banks, in shelters where you will learn what it means to give, to help others, just as you were helped today. But beyond that, I am doing something else, something no court has ever done before." Olivia's heart skipped a beat. What was he saying? "I'm ordering that you be placed into a foster home immediately. And not just any foster home. A place where you can feel safe. A place where you will be cared for. A place where you will no longer have to face the world alone." The words were so surreal, so unexpected, that Olivia could barely process them. She blinked, trying to make sense of what the judge had said. Was this a dream? Was he serious? The room had gone completely still. The audience watched in stunned silence. The prosecutor's mouth hung open, and even she couldn't find the words to object. "Olivia," Judge Carter continued, "you deserve a chance at a life that isn't defined by fear, by hunger, by loneliness. You deserve to grow up in a place where you are loved, where you are given the chance to dream, to learn, to have hope." Olivia's hands trembled, and tears began to well up in her eyes. She hadn't believed it was possible. She hadn't believed anyone could care enough to change her life. But here it was. A chance. A real, honest-to-goodness chance. Judge Carter stood, his gavel held firmly in his hand. "This court is adjourned. Olivia Brooks, go and begin the life you deserve." The sound of the gavel striking the wood was louder than usual, echoing in the silence. Olivia didn't know what to do. She didn't know how to react. All she could do was stand there, the tears streaming down her face, and allow herself to believe, just for a moment, that her life might finally change. The day after the court hearing was a blur for Olivia. She had never expected anything like this. One moment, She had been standing in a courtroom, lost and alone. And the next, she had been given a chance, an actual chance to have a life that was different from the one she had known. She had been taken to a new place, a house that smelled of fresh paint and unfamiliar comfort. It didn't feel like home, not at first. How could it? Olivia had spent so many years in places that never felt safe, never felt like they belonged to her. She had learned to keep her guard up, to not expect too much, to not hope for things that could easily be taken away. But now, standing in this new house, with a bed all to herself and a soft pillow under her head, she couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of something real, something lasting. The house was small but cozy, with a white picket fence out front and a small garden that looked like it had been cared for. A few flowers bloomed in the yard, and Olivia could smell the fresh air and the faint scent of cookies baking in the kitchen. It felt like something out of a storybook. It looked like what a home should look like, not the crumbling, broken house she had come from. She sat on the edge of the bed, her legs dangling, staring out of the window at the sunlight filtering through the leaves of the trees outside. For the first time in years, she felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. There were no sirens in the distance, no sounds of arguing, no shadows lurking around every corner. Just peace. But it wasn't easy. The weight of her past still hung over her like a shadow. Even though the room was warm and inviting, she felt like an intruder. She wasn't used to kindness. She wasn't used to being cared for. Every creak of the house, every voice that called her name, felt foreign, almost too good to be true. A knock at the door broke her thoughts. Olivia looked up quickly, her heart racing. Was she in trouble? Did they want her to leave? She didn't know what to expect anymore. The door opened slowly, and a woman stepped inside. She was in her 30s, with kind eyes and dark hair pulled back into a ponytail. Her smile was warm like sunlight. She wore a simple sweater and jeans, looking like someone who didn't have to try too hard to be kind. "Hey, Olivia," the woman said, her voice soft and comforting. "How are you feeling?" Olivia didn't know how to answer. No one had ever asked her that before. No one had ever really cared about how she felt. "I'm okay," Olivia replied, her voice hesitant, unsure. She didn't know what to say. She wasn't sure she even knew how to talk to someone who wasn't asking her to do something, someone who wasn't angry or disappointed in her. The woman smiled again, sitting down on the bed next to Olivia. "I'm Sarah," she said. "I'm going to be your foster mom." Olivia looked at her, confused. Foster mom. What did that even mean? Could it be true? Was this really happening? "I know it might feel strange," Sarah continued, sensing Olivia's uncertainty. "But I want you to know that you're safe here. You don't have to worry about anything. We're going to take care of you." Olivia's heart skipped a beat. "Take care of me," she repeated, almost to herself. It was the first time someone had said something like that to her. She had never been taken care of before. She had always been the one to take care of herself, to figure things out on her own. And now someone was saying they would take care of her. Sarah nodded. "Yes, Olivia. You're not alone anymore. We're a family now." Family. The word felt heavy, like something she wasn't sure she could hold. She had heard that word before, but it had never meant anything real to her. It had always been just a word, like an idea that belonged to other people, people who had mothers and fathers and houses that didn't fall apart. She wasn't sure if she could trust it, but the way Sarah said it, so gently, so kindly, it made her want to believe. "I'm not used to this," Olivia said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to be a part of a family." Sarah smiled softly, her eyes filled with understanding. "That's okay, Olivia. You don't have to know everything right away. It takes time. But you're welcome here. We'll take it one day at a time." Olivia nodded slowly, still unsure. She didn't know if she could ever feel like she truly belonged here, in this place that was so foreign to her. But she didn't have to make up her mind today. For the first time in a long time, she didn't have to worry about where she would sleep, what she would eat, or whether she would be safe. "We have dinner ready," Sarah said, standing up. "Would you like to join us?" Olivia hesitated, her stomach rumbling at the thought of food. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in days, maybe longer. The thought of sitting at a table, eating food that didn't come from a store she had stolen it from, felt almost impossible. "I'm not really hungry," Olivia said, looking away, not wanting to admit how much she actually wanted to eat. "That's okay," Sarah said kindly. "You don't have to eat if you're not hungry. But I'll leave the food for you, just in case." Olivia didn't know why, but something about Sarah's kindness made her want to try. Maybe it wasn't so bad, this family thing. Maybe she could learn how to belong. As Sarah left the room, Olivia looked around the space again. She was still trying to get used to it all. The soft carpet, the warm light, the fact that no one was yelling. No one was telling her what to do. For the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe. She could just be. The thought was overwhelming, but in a way that felt good. She wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't fighting to survive anymore. There were people here who cared. People who wanted to help her, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Slowly, she stood up from the bed and walked to the door. Her feet shuffled across the floor, the soft carpet brushing against her toes. She peeked out into the hallway, and Sarah was waiting for her at the end, a warm smile on her face. "Dinner's almost ready," Sarah said. "Are you sure you don't want to come?" Olivia thought for a moment. She was still scared, still uncertain, but the hunger in her stomach won over. She nodded. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll come." As they sat down at the table together, Olivia couldn't help but glance around at the people who were now part of her life. Sarah sat beside her, and there was a man sitting across from them. Someone she hadn't met yet, but who smiled at her in a way that felt warm, not forced. They ate together, talking and laughing. Olivia had never been part of something like this before. She was used to eating alone, in silence, in whatever place she could find. But here, there was conversation. There was kindness. There was food, real food, and a sense of comfort that made her feel safe. Maybe, just maybe, this place could be home. Olivia woke up early the next morning, the sunlight spilling through the window and casting soft shadows on the walls. She lay in bed for a few moments, just staring at the ceiling. Everything felt strange, but in a good way. The bed was comfortable, the room warm. There was no noise outside, no sirens, no shouting, just peace. But even in the quiet, her mind raced. She couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The court, the judge, Sarah. Everything was so new. She had never been given a chance like this before. The idea of a future was still hard for her to grasp. Could she really have a future? Could someone like her, someone who had lived through so much pain and fear, actually have a chance at a better life? She sighed, sitting up slowly. Her legs hung over the side of the bed, and she rubbed her eyes, still trying to shake off the sleep. She wasn't sure what to do with herself. The day ahead felt like a huge unknown, full of questions she couldn't answer. After a few minutes, she heard a knock on the door. Olivia quickly stood up, straightening her shirt and trying to gather herself. She wasn't used to being asked to do things or having someone care about whether she was okay. But here, in this new place, things were different. "Olivia." Sarah's voice called through the door. "It's time for breakfast." Olivia hesitated, unsure if she should go. The thought of sitting at the table with Sarah and the others made her nervous. She wasn't sure if she was ready to be part of something like that, a real family. But then again, she had nowhere else to go. She didn't want to be alone again. She opened the door and stepped into the hallway, her heart pounding a little faster. "I'll be right there," she said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. The smell of pancakes and bacon drifted down the stairs, and her stomach growled. It had been so long since she had eaten a real meal that the thought of food almost felt overwhelming. She had to admit, she was hungry. When Olivia reached the kitchen, she found Sarah already setting the table. The man from last night, a tall guy with short brown hair, was sitting at the table, reading the newspaper. Olivia couldn't help but notice how different this was. The warmth of the kitchen, the quiet chatter, the smell of food. It felt like something out of a dream. But it wasn't a dream. It was real. And for once, Olivia wasn't sure whether to feel scared or grateful. "Good morning, Olivia." Sarah greeted her with a bright smile. "Come on in. I made your favorite, pancakes." Olivia blinked, taken aback. "My favorite." Sarah laughed softly. "You didn't tell me, but I guessed. I know most kids love pancakes. I thought it might be a nice start to the day." Olivia couldn't help but smile, even though she felt a little embarrassed. It was the first time anyone had done something like that for her. Something just for her. She sat down slowly at the table, her hands trembling a bit as she reached for the Sarah. The man, who must have been Sarah's husband, looked up from his newspaper and smiled at her. "Morning, Olivia. I'm Ben." Olivia nodded, her cheeks turning red. "Hi," she said quietly. She wasn't sure what else to say. She wasn't used to this kind of attention. Ben put down his paper and gave her a kind look. "How are you doing? Settling in okay?" Olivia's hands gripped the edge of the table, and she swallowed before answering. It's different," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to think." "Yeah, it's a lot to get used to," Ben said. "But we're glad you're here. Take your time. We're not in a rush." The kindness in his voice almost made Olivia feel like she could breathe easier. She took a deep breath and began eating, the pancakes tasting sweeter than anything she had ever eaten. As she chewed, though, a feeling of guilt began to creep in. How long would this last? What would happen if things didn't work out? What if they decided they didn't want her here anymore? She quickly pushed those thoughts away. She wasn't going to think about that now. She had to focus on the present, on what was happening right in front of her. And right now, it felt good to be here, sitting at a table, eating a meal with people who seemed to care. After breakfast, Sarah and Ben took Olivia to the local school to register her. Olivia was nervous. She hadn't been to school in a long time. The idea of sitting in a classroom with other kids, some of whom probably had everything she didn't, made her stomach twist. "You'll do great," Sarah said as they walked into the school, her voice full of encouragement. "Don't worry. Just be yourself." Olivia didn't say anything in response. She wasn't sure if she could just be herself. She didn't even know who that was anymore. The Olivia who had lived on the streets, the Olivia who had to steal food just to survive. Could that person fit into a normal life? As they sat in the principal's office, Olivia couldn't help but feel out of place. The room was full of neat desks, bright posters on the walls, and an atmosphere of calm she wasn't used to. She had never been in a school like this. Everything felt foreign and strange, like she was an outsider looking in. "Olivia," the principal said, looking up from his desk, "we're happy to have you here. I know it's a big change, but we'll make sure you have everything you need to succeed." The principal's voice was warm and welcoming, but Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong. The other kids would never understand. They wouldn't know what it was like to sleep in abandoned buildings, to go days without eating, to fight just to stay alive. How could she ever fit in with them? Sarah seemed to sense Olivia's unease. She gave her a gentle smile and squeezed her hand. "It's okay, Olivia. We're in this together." As they left the principal's office, Olivia felt a weight in her chest. She didn't know if she was ready for school, for all the new things she was supposed to learn. But one thing was clear. She had a chance now. A chance to fight for a future. A chance to build something better than the life she had come from. It wasn't going to be easy. Nothing ever was. There would be challenges, struggles, moments when she would want to give up. But she had to try. She had to believe that this new life, was worth fighting for. As they drove home, Olivia looked out the window, her eyes fixed on the world passing by. It was a world she had never really been part of, but maybe, just maybe, she could change that. She could fight for a future that wasn't defined by fear or hunger. She could fight for a future where she was more than just a survivor. And for the first time in her life, she felt like maybe that future was possible. The day of the next hearing arrived faster than Olivia could have imagined. She had been trying to focus on her new life, on school, on the things that were finally starting to feel somewhat normal. But that shadow from the past still loomed over her, a constant reminder that her future wasn't guaranteed. The courtroom awaited her again, and with it, the uncertainty of what might happen next. She woke up early that morning, her stomach tied in knots. Even though Sarah and Ben had tried to reassure her, even though they promised her everything would be okay, Olivia couldn't shake the fear. The court had the power to change everything. What if they decided she wasn't worthy of this new life? What if they sent her back to the system, to foster homes that felt more like temporary stops than real homes? What if they took everything away from her? Sarah was already awake when Olivia went downstairs. She was in the kitchen, making breakfast. The sound of sizzling eggs filled the room, and the smell made Olivia's stomach growl. But she wasn't hungry. How could she eat when her mind was so clouded with worry? "Good morning, Olivia," Sarah said, her voice calm but warm. She turned to smile at her, but the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Olivia knew Sarah was worried too. Sarah had never been through something like this. Olivia was the first foster child they had taken in, and everything was new for her too. "I don't want to go," Olivia whispered, her voice tight. She stared at the floor, unable to meet Sarah's eyes. Sarah set down the spatula and walked over to Olivia, kneeling down in front of her so they were eye level. "I know you're scared," she said softly, "but you don't have to face this alone. We'll be with you every step of the way." Olivia swallowed hard, nodding, but she didn't feel reassured. Her mind kept racing with the possibilities of what might happen in that cold, sterile courtroom. She had no control over what they would decide, no way of knowing how it would turn out. Ben walked in just then, his face serious. He must have been up early, like Sarah, trying to get ready for the day. "Are you ready?" he asked, glancing between Olivia and Sarah. "I don't know if I'm ready," Olivia muttered, her hands trembling slightly. She could feel the weight of the day pressing down on her chest, heavy and suffocating. Sarah placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's okay not to feel ready. Just take a deep breath. And remember, this is just one day, one step." Olivia nodded, but she didn't believe it. How could one day decide her future? How could she possibly keep her head above water when it felt like the waves were crashing over her? When they arrived at the courthouse, the same nervous energy in the air greeted them. It was a place full of judgment, decisions, and the weight of other people's words determining the fate of those who walked through the doors. Olivia felt small and insignificant in comparison to the grand, cold building. The walls seemed to close in on her as she stepped inside. Sarah held her hand tightly as they walked through the halls, Ben a few steps behind them. Olivia's eyes darted nervously around, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried not to think about the people who were likely to judge her in the courtroom. The judge, the social workers, the attorneys. How could she explain what she needed when she didn't even fully understand it herself? When they reached the courtroom, they were led inside by a bailiff. The room was much larger than Olivia expected, with wooden benches and a large desk where the judge would sit. Everything was so formal, so serious. She felt like she was in the middle of a stage, with everyone watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. She took a seat next to Sarah, and Ben sat on the other side of her. They all looked straight ahead, trying to look calm, but Olivia could see the worry in their eyes too. They were doing their best to keep it together, but Olivia knew they were just as afraid as she was. Soon, the door at the front of the room opened, and the judge entered. The room fell silent as everyone stood to acknowledge him. He was an older man, with gray hair and sharp, calculating eyes. He looked at Olivia as he took his seat, and she felt a wave of unease wash over her. She wasn't sure what it was. Maybe it was the way he looked at her, like he was trying to figure out whether she deserved to be there or not. "Please be seated," the judge said in a deep voice, his tone commanding. The room settled back into silence as everyone took their seats. Olivia could feel the tension in the air as the hearing began. Her lawyer spoke first, presenting Olivia's case, emphasizing how much progress she had made since coming to live with Sarah and Ben. She was enrolled in school, attending therapy, and was starting to feel like she was part of a family. There was hope for her, they said. She wasn't the same girl she had been before. Olivia's heart raced as she listened, trying to believe what they were saying. She wanted to believe that this new life was real, that she had a chance at a future, but everything felt so fragile. What if the judge didn't see it that way? Then, the social worker stood up to speak. She was a woman with short, neatly combed hair and a stern face. She didn't seem to care much for Olivia's progress or her potential. All she seemed to care about was following the rules. "I'm concerned that Olivia may not be ready for permanent placement," the social worker said, her voice cold and detached. "Her history is complicated, and there are too many risks involved in granting her adoption. It would be better for her to remain in the system where she can be evaluated further." Olivia felt the ground beneath her feet shake. Her heart dropped. Was this it? Was this where everything fell apart? She looked up at Sarah, who gave her a small, encouraging nod, but Olivia could see the worry in her eyes too. Ben's hand was firmly resting on her shoulder, but Olivia could feel his tension too. The words felt like they were cutting through her, like she wasn't even a person to these people, just a file, just a case number. The judge looked down at his papers, nodding thoughtfully. Olivia's stomach twisted into knots as she waited for him to speak. After a moment of silence, the judge cleared his throat. "I hear the concerns of the social worker," he said slowly, his voice echoing in the large room. "However, I have also heard the testimony of Ms. Matthews and Mr. Evans, who have shown a clear commitment to providing Olivia with a stable and supportive environment." Olivia held her breath. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. "I will be granting temporary custody to the Evans family," the judge continued. "But I want a follow-up hearing in 6 months to assess Olivia's progress. If things continue as they have, we can discuss adoption at that time." After a moment of silence, the judge cleared his throat. "I hear the concerns of the social worker," he said slowly, his voice echoing in the large room. "However, I have also heard the testimony of Ms. Matthews and Mr. Evans, who have shown a clear commitment to providing Olivia with a stable and supportive environment." Olivia held her breath. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. "I will be granting temporary custody to the Evans family," the judge continued. "But I want a follow-up hearing in 6 months to assess Olivia's progress. If things continue as they have, we can discuss adoption at that time." A wave of relief washed over Olivia, but it didn't last long. It was only temporary. There was still so much uncertainty, so much left to prove. She had to fight every day to show that she deserved this life, that she could be a part of something real. But for now, for today, she had won. And that was enough. As the judge dismissed the court, Olivia felt a hand on her arm. Sarah's voice was soft and steady. "We're going to make it, Olivia. We're in this together." Olivia looked up at her, her heart full. For the first time, in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe it wouldn't be easy. Maybe it wouldn't be perfect. But it was a chance, and that was more than she had ever hoped for. The months passed quickly after that day in court. Olivia had spent a lot of time adjusting to her new life, to the family who had given her a chance when she didn't think anyone ever would. Sarah and Ben had been patient with her, guiding her through the small steps that felt so big to her. They helped her find her place, not just in their home, but in the world. It wasn't always easy. Some mornings, Olivia would wake up and feel like she didn't belong in this peaceful house, like she was pretending to be something she wasn't. She'd look in the mirror and see the girl from the streets, the girl who had learned to survive, not to dream. But with every passing day, the person she was becoming felt more real. Every day, she was learning to leave the past behind, to trust that the future might just be better than she thought. One afternoon, Sarah and Ben decided to take her out to a local park. It was a warm day, and the sun shone brightly, making everything look golden. Sarah packed a picnic basket, and they drove to a spot near a large, quiet lake. The park was peaceful, with trees swaying gently in the breeze and birds chirping overhead. At first, Olivia felt a little out of place. She had never been on a picnic like this before. She watched as Ben spread out a blanket, and Sarah set up the food. People around them were laughing, talking, enjoying the day. Olivia sat quietly, her eyes darting around as she tried to make sense of it all. "You all right?" Ben asked, looking up from his task of opening a bottle of juice. Olivia blinked, realizing she had been staring. "Yeah, just thinking." Sarah sat down next to her, holding a plate of sandwiches. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, her voice warm and kind. Olivia hesitated. "I don't know. It just feels like everything's so perfect here. And I'm not sure I fit in. I never had this before. This kind of life." Sarah smiled gently, placing a hand on Olivia's. "You don't have to be perfect, Olivia. None of us are. But we're here for you, and we're happy you're here with us." Ben sat down next to them and handed Olivia a sandwich. "You fit in just fine. You've been part of this family since the moment you walked through our door." Olivia felt a lump form in her throat. It was hard to believe that someone could care about her this much, that she could truly belong. She took the sandwich from Ben, her hands trembling slightly, and smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes fully. She was still unsure, still afraid of being let down. They ate quietly for a while, the sound of the water lapping at the shore and the rustle of leaves in the trees creating a peaceful atmosphere. Olivia's thoughts drifted to the upcoming months. The judge's decision had been temporary, but things were looking better. She was going to school, she was adjusting, and she had a family. But the thought of adoption still hung in the air. What if she wasn't enough? What if one day they realized they didn't really want her after all? "You look deep in thought again," Ben said, breaking her thoughts. Olivia looked up, startled. "Sorry," she mumbled. "Nothing to apologize for," Ben said, giving her a kind smile. "Just remember, no matter what happens, we're not going anywhere." Sarah reached over, brushing a stray piece of hair from Olivia's face. "We're in this together, always." For the first time in a long time, Olivia believed them. She wanted to believe them. She smiled back, the warmth of their words settling in her heart. As the day wore on, Olivia began to relax. She joined in on a game of catch with Ben and Sarah, something she never thought she would enjoy. They laughed, ran, and joked with each other, and for the first time in her life, Olivia felt like she wasn't just surviving. She was living. After the picnic, they walked along the lake, taking in the fresh air. Olivia noticed the way Sarah and Ben interacted with each other, how comfortable they were, how much they cared for one another. She could see how much they loved her too. It was in the little things, the way they included her in their conversations, the way they looked out for her. And it was more than just love. It was acceptance. Later that week, Olivia got an unexpected invitation. One of the girls from her new school, Emma, had asked her to join her and a few friends for a movie night. Olivia had never really had friends, not real ones. The girls she had known in the past had mostly used her or ignored her. The idea of going to someone's house felt strange, but Emma had been kind to her at school, always talking to her, asking her questions. She seemed to genuinely want to be friends. Olivia wasn't sure if she should go. What if she messed things up? What if they didn't like her? But Sarah encouraged her to go, telling her that it would be a good opportunity to make new memories. "Just be yourself," Sarah said with a wink. "You'll be fine." That night, Olivia stood in front of the mirror, nervously adjusting her clothes. She wasn't sure what to wear. She didn't have many clothes that were normal enough for a sleepover, but Sarah had helped her pick out a simple t-shirt and jeans. "You look great," Sarah said, giving her a thumbs up as she adjusted the collar of Olivia's shirt. Olivia smiled weakly. Thanks. At Emma's house, Olivia was met with a group of friendly faces. Emma's friends greeted her warmly, and Olivia felt a wave of relief. Maybe this wouldn't be so hard after all. They ate popcorn, laughed at the silly movie, and talked about school. Olivia was surprised by how much fun she was having. She hadn't realized how much she had missed the simple pleasure of being around people her age, of just being a normal girl. Later, as they were lying on the floor, the lights turned off, and the movie played on in the background. Olivia found herself smiling more than she had in months. She felt like she belonged. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like an outsider. She felt like she was part of something. The next morning, Olivia returned home, her heart lighter than it had been in a long time. As she walked through the front door, Ben greeted her with a big smile. So, how was it? Olivia grinned, her face brightening. It was fun. I think I made some new friends. That's great, Ben said, giving her a high five. Sarah stepped out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. You look happy. I'm glad you had a good time. I did, Olivia replied, her voice full of excitement. I didn't think it would be so easy to fit in. You fit in because you're you, Sarah said, pulling her into a warm hug. We're all lucky to have you. For the first time in her life, Olivia felt like she was truly wanted. Not because of what she could do for someone, but just because she was herself. She had found a place where she was seen, where she was loved. Over the next few months, things began to change for Olivia. She grew more confident, more sure of herself. She was no longer just a girl from the streets. She was Olivia, the girl who had fought for a second chance and found a family. The girl who had stolen hearts without even trying. And in her heart, she knew one thing for sure. She was finally home.